You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, all eyes are on this feud that has erupted between the Trump administration and a federal judge. The judge ordered that a wrongly deported migrant be returned to the U.S. by April 7th at 11:59 p.m. The DOJ, Trump's Department of Justice, requested a stay, meaning to block this order from being carried out. The judge now responded to this request by the DOJ. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, the judge reaffirmed that there is absolutely no lawful basis for this man, Mr. Garcia, to be in El Salvador because he had a court order prohibiting the United States from deporting him to El Salvador. He has no reason to be in a prison in El Salvador, and there is absolutely no reason why the Trump administration cannot bring him back pronto. So she reaffirmed her order. She said, no. There will be no stay. There will be no pause. There will be no reconsideration of my ruling. You will return Mr. Garcia to the United States by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, April 7th. And she said something else. She emphasized in her 22-page order that Mr. Garcia's detention in El Salvador is, quote, wholly lawless. When I read that, Brian, I thought, that would probably make an appropriate hashtag to describe the Trump administration more broadly. Hashtag wholly lawless. So that is where things stand. But there were a couple of other interesting developments in this 22-page opinion that actually have relatively little to do with what's going on in court, but a whole lot to do with what's going on between the walls at the Department of Justice.
Glenn, I want to dig into what happens now, what the Trump administration's recourse is here. So obviously, one step that they could take is just comply with the judge's order. Another step they can take is to ignore the judge's order. And a third step is to seek some type of remedy at an appeals court. Can you explain what their options are?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I can tell you the most likely option is they're probably preparing their appeal right now to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals that sits atop the Maryland Federal District Court. So I have a feeling probably either late Sunday night, early Monday morning, you're going to see an emergency appeal filed asking the appeals court to stay or pause Judge Chines's order that he must be returned by Monday just shy of midnight. They could also defy the order, but I don't think they'll do that. I think they'll file the appeal, or of course they could comply with the order, which would involve nothing more than sending a plane down there, asking the El Salvadoran authorities to give Mr. Garcia back. And Brian, they are detaining him for us at our request and at our expense. So the judge, pretty much laughed at a court the notion that the federal government doesn't have the ability. It's, quote, impossible for them to get him back. It's clearly not. But I think you're right. I think an emergency appeal, is most likely what we're going to see next.
If we see an emergency appeal, does that mean that the appeals court has to respond before 11:59 p.m.? Because if they don't do anything, if they opt not to comply, but they have the appeal pending, we're kind of in this weird limbo where the prevailing order is still the one that was set forth by the district court.
Yeah, they don't have to, but I will tell you, in the overwhelming majority of emergency appeals, the appeals court, sort of as a matter of respect to the lower court and to the parties, they will offer some kind of a reply. The reply may very well be, we're not taking this matter up expeditiously, and the lower court ruling will remain in effect. Sometimes they will say, you know what, we will issue what's called an administrative stay, which is a nice way to say, listen, we don't believe the party seeking this appeal is necessarily right, but we're going to just freeze things, albeit fleetingly, maybe for a couple of days or a week while we resolve the legal issue. Usually they will respond because they don't like to just be radio silent and let the parties in the lower court kind of struggle to figure out what to do next.
And then, Glenn, we've spoken about this in previous episodes, but I think it's worth re-upping here. What happens in the event that the Trump administration simply opts not to comply? Even if the appeals court says, nope, we're not going to touch this thing, the lower court, the ruling is valid, there's no reason for us to change this ruling or step in here, we're not going to approve your request for a stay, and you have to return Mr. Garcia by 11:59 p.m. on April 7th.
Yeah, what happens is Judge Shines almost certainly moves toward contempt proceedings to try to force the administration to comply. And if they continue to refuse, she can consider confining, jailing, holding in contempt after the officials receive their due process, their notice and opportunity to be heard on the issue, which is their, Fifth Amendment due process constitutional right, the very right they're depriving these immigrants by summarily shipping them down to an El Salvador prison. She will almost certainly move in the direction of contempt with the hope that maybe it will coerce the administration to come into compliance with her order.
Glenn, what kind of enforcement mechanism is there in the courts to try and get the executive branch to do its bidding, to do whatever its rulings are? I mean, who is the muscle behind the judicial branch? Because if the courts are telling the executive branch to do something, presumably you'd need some type of law enforcement authority to be able to do that. And aren't the law enforcement authorities themselves under the purview of the executive branch?
Yeah, we've been talking about this quite a bit. First of all, the muscle is the Constitution. The muscle is that we have co-equal branches of government, and one is constitutionally obligated to respect the lawful authority of the others. That's the actual muscle.
Right. That muscle has been atrophying lately, though.
Yeah, that muscle has not been to the gym in a very long time with Trump in power. I'll give you that much, Brian. But so if you want to talk about boots on the ground law enforcement, muscle and power and might, it is the United States Marshal Service, and they are the ones who are lawfully obligated. For anybody scoring at home, they can look at the federal code, Title 28, Section 566C, Charlie, and they will see that the federal law provides that the U.S. Marshals shall, that's mandatory, enforce federal court orders and shall, acquire any resources they need to do so. People will say, yeah, but the marshals are part of the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice is part of the executive branch under the control of a criminal president, Donald Trump, all of which is true. But that does not negate the lawful duty of the marshals to execute, to enforce those court orders. And it's anybody's guess as to how this constitutional conflict and, frankly, true constitutional crisis, if the executive branch is hell-bent on defying judicial branch orders, how it plays out.
Right. I would push back and say, yes, the Constitution requires that the marshals enforce whatever the court rulings are, but the Constitution is also the heart of all of these matters, which is that what Trump is doing is defying the Constitution. He's defying the law. And so if he's that willing to defy the Constitution and federal law and federal judge rulings, then why would he suddenly opt to respect the jurisdiction or the powers of the marshals?
Well, Brian, it will come down to if the good men and women of the Marshal Service, of the Department of Justice, of the FBI, and ultimately of the military are willing to abide by their oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign, and most importantly, in our present circumstances, domestic, then our government holds. But if everybody lays down and, abides by whatever a lawless president or a lawless commander-in-chief, in the case of the military services, if they all lay down, then there is no hope. Then our republic is at an end. Our Constitution, loses. We might as well tear it up and throw it out. I just don't think that is necessarily where we will end up. I know Donald Trump thinks, and now Pam Bondi, his attorney general, thinks that they can fire their way through all of the ethical people in the Marshal Service and the FBI and the Department of Justice. And we just saw an instance of that because the very attorney, the DOJ attorney, Brian, who went into court in the Garcia case, and he made representations, statements, arguments to the judge that were honest, ethical, accurate, and truthful, including telling the judge, I don't have information or evidence for you about why Mr. Garcia is being detained at this terrorist prison in El Salvador. I haven't been provided that information, and I'm sorry, but I can't answer your question. You know what happened to that DOJ lawyer, Brian? Well, just today, he was put on immediate administrative leave, and according to Attorney General Pam Bondi, he is, quote, no longer working with the department. I don't know if that means he's been fired from the Department of Justice. And not only did Mr. Ravini, the attorney who was in court arguing this matter, get put on administrative leave, his supervisor got put on immediate administrative leave as well. They think they can fire their way through all of the honest, ethical public servants. Brian, they can't. Take it from somebody who was inside the federal government for 30 years. They can't. This is not sustainable. This will end up imploding in the long run. And, I think the republic will hold, and I think the good men and women of the federal government will stand up, will refuse to do the unlawful bidding of Donald Trump, Pam Bondi, and the rest of Trump's, lapdogs, flunkies, and sycophants in the executive branch. And I think at the end of the day, it is Trump who will implode, not our Constitution.
Do you have any worry that by virtue of Pam Bondi and the DOJ leadership firing these prosecutors or attorneys who dare make ethical, honest representations in court, that they're just going to get replaced by people who are more in the mold of Bondi, Beauvais, and Trump?
They can bring in a pack of liars to go into court and just say whatever Donald Trump wants them to say.
But that's going to degrade the quality of attorney that they have representing the DOJ then, right?
Exactly. And frankly, it's not even representing the DOJ. It's representing the American people.
Yeah.
It was my job as a federal prosecutor to represent the interests of the American people, not any of the presidents under whom I served. And here's what Pam Bondi just wrote to all of the employees at the Department of Justice after she directed that these two DOJ lawyers be put on immediate administrative leave for, having the gall to basically make truthful, accurate representations in connection with the Garcia case. AG Bondi sent out this missive. At my direction, every Department of Justice attorney is required to zealously advocate on behalf of the United States. Any attorney who fails to abide by this direction will face consequences. Brian, I may not know everything about leadership or supervision, but what I do know, having supervised lots of attorneys, both as an Army JAG supervising other Army attorneys and at the Department of Justice, supervising dozens and dozens and dozens of federal homicide prosecutors, the one thing I know about leadership is that there are three important rules for good leaders, and they are support your people, and support your people. Pam Bondi is doing the exact opposite. She's punishing her people. She's turning on her people. She's stabbing her people in the back for going into court and making the best, honest, ethical, accurate representations to a judge they can make. Do you think they're going to find a lot of folks after this who are ready to rush into court and do Donald Trump's bidding? Are you flipping kidding me? So this is not sustainable, and our viewers should hold fast to the notion that this is not going to bring our democracy down. The idiots, the imbeciles, and the incompetents like Pam Bondi and the other folks that Donald Trump has populated his executive branch with.
All right, well, this case is obviously moving very quickly. So if for anybody watching, you want to continue to follow along, especially as we very quickly approach the April 7th deadline, please make sure to subscribe. I'll put the links to both of our channels right here on this screen. Glenn is fast approaching 1 million subscribers, so especially if you're not yet subscribed to his channel yet, please hit the subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.